humans are not washing machines. We are emotional beings. We have feelings. We expect outcomes, but we don't work towards those outcomes. We're really just focused on the what, and we're not really focused on things like our story, things like our state, our emotional, our mental state. Intentional living essentially is trying our best to live in alignment with the things that we value most.
How can we actually move them from the page into day-to-day behavior change and action?
You absolutely need to have low seasons where you can actually refuel your creative juices. Just promise yourself, do one thing for your business every day.
Today's guest is Ryan Fahey. Ryan is an author, speaker, and consultant who helps people make clear decisions about their values, work, well-being, and energy. In our conversation, we discuss a new approach to setting goals that can help you actually achieve them, just in changing how you set them, and how to identify the values that should guide your decisions. If you get value from this conversation, be sure to subscribe and share it with a friend. And now please enjoy my conversation with Ryan Fahey. Ryan, thank you so much for being here.
Ian, thanks for having me on your show. For everyone listening in, this is going to be an exciting conversation. So thanks for spending some time with us here today. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. I was super excited in the prep that I was doing for our conversation, just going through all of your work, the years upon years of work that you've done in this domain, in this arena. You've built up a wealth of knowledge on a subject that really matters. And I think a lot of people, including myself, need to hear and learn more about. But so Ryan, your work, as I mentioned, operates in the arena of values, energy, and living with more intention. And most people, including myself, probably have a sense of what matters to them, right? Like I care about my health, I care about my happiness, inner peace, but our daily lives still do not reflect those values. So why do our lives so easily drift away from what we say matters?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I first should say I'm still learning as I go too, right? Like life is always kind of coming at you and changing. And it's busy. But I think, one of the biggest reasons why we kind of drift away from those things is just we struggle as a society with self-awareness. When I deliver workshops, I actually create space for attendees to actually investigate and have time to kind of explore things like their energy, things like their core values, which we'll get into here in this conversation. And a lot of the feedback I get from folks is that they never really had time, or they never really dedicated any time to actually sit and go through that process. And we live at a time where we have all the information we need, but sometimes it's actually about kind of closing that out for a minute and just kind of focusing inward and doing a bit of an assessment of where is our energy going? What is it we truly enjoy? What makes us actually happy in this moment, in this chapter of our lives? And again, it's always changing too, right? So I think that's a big thing. Another piece too, Ian, is the fringe hours of our lives have shifted. So if you went back 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago, you kind of had your 9 to 5, most folks did, or they ran a business or whatever that was. But the evenings, the weekends, and the mornings, those fringe hours were often spent with things like family and community, eating together, socializing together. And the game has changed. That is very different. We live in a time where, the rapid pace of technology has given us the opportunity to have side hustles, to have a second job, to have a business that requires us to constantly kind of be on. And that's fine. But what ends up happening is that we get kind of inundated in those fringe hours versus taking time in those hours to actually maybe sink into the other pieces of our lives that we do value and the things that make us happy and fulfilled. So I think that's another one. A final one I'll note too, Ian, is this is something that comes up quite a bit. One of the things I try to talk about as well is like 80% of New Year's resolutions fail every year, or over 80%. And typically those failures happen by March. And that doesn't mean we're bad people. It just means that we're really just focused on the what, and we're not really focused on things like our story, things like our state, our emotional, our mental state. So I kind of break this down into the 3 S's: our state, our story, and our strategy. And resolutions go right to the strategy, but they fail to neglect those first two. And that's why so many of us fail at our goals and so many of us fail at our resolutions. So what I try to actually do is create space to investigate where is our mental state at in this moment, in this day, and what is the story that we're telling ourselves? Are we telling ourselves that we need to work harder, work more, work longer hours? Or are we telling ourselves that we're enough today, that we have accomplished what we set out to do today, that, we can wait and put this off until tomorrow? And so sometimes having that moment to really go through those three S's can just allow us the space we need to make more mindful decisions around that.
Mm. Yeah, that is a new insight. I haven't heard the idea of your story and the story you're telling yourself being an essential element of accomplishing a goal, right? I think you hit it right on the head that most people, when they set goals for themselves, and I'll use myself as an example, when I set goals for myself or for my business, it's all just focused on the strategy. So why is the story, those other two S's, so important in achieving and accomplishing a goal?
Yeah, it's a great question. And strategy is kind of what we're taught, right? We're taught that in school. We're taught that in university. We're taught that in a society that that values kind of performance metrics and productivity, and that's okay. But what's not valued so much in society are what are the inner workings of our mental state, and what are those kind of stories that we might be telling ourselves. And so I think that they're absolutely critical, because if you wake up in the morning and on a scale of 0 to 5, 5 being I feel optimal and 0 being I don't feel great at all, if you're a 1 or a 2, it's going to be really, really hard to kind of feel optimal that day. Maybe a 3 for you is what you're kind of going for. But if you're not aware of where your state is, you can kind of have these unachievable expectations when you start your day. Oh, I should be up here. I should be here. Well, why am I not here? Well, it's actually, it's where I'm at today. And so I think we get into kind of comparing sometimes too, right? We all know what a level 5 kind of day looks like, right? In terms of productivity, in terms of outputs and energy and all of that. But that life happens. And sometimes we're stuck at a 1, we're stuck at a 2. And we need to acknowledge that that's where we're at. And we need to just work from that place. And stories are interesting as well, because unless you have mentors and you have other kind of business people in your corner that can support you, you can, slide into a story that potentially you need to stop telling, or you may not be even thinking about the right story. And so that can be limiting, right? It can limit what you're capable of. And I've experienced this in my business as well. And it's important to have those people that kind of thrust us forward and lift us up to kind of elevate those stories, re-examine those stories, and re-examine what's possible. Hard to do, I will admit, but it is critical. And so I think everybody out there, if there's one takeaway, find that business mentor that's maybe 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of you. Get a cup of coffee with them, have a human to human conversation, and really investigate, talk about the stories that they had along their journey as well.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. So every goal, let's say, just to use a simple term that we set for ourselves, should really be complete with 3 elements, right? It should be clarity on the state that's going to be required in order for us to, execute and do the things that we need to do, just an awareness of our state. Then the story that we're telling ourselves en route to achieving this goal, and then also the strategy, like the actual tactical thing that we are going to go execute, the things that we are going to do in order to achieve this goal. Is that right?
Absolutely, Ian. You summarized it perfectly. Well done.
Love it. Okay, sweet. So going back to that initial question then, so we have, we start the year, we set new goals, we start a new quarter, we set new goals for our business, for ourselves, whatever, whenever you're setting goals for yourself. Most of the time, a reason that we drift off track after we've set these goals is because we haven't completed the goal, right? We've only clarified the strategy. We haven't taken the actual human, ourselves into the equation on like what else is required in order for us to operate the way that we need to in order to execute that strategy and then ultimately achieve that goal, which is the state and the story. So kind of a part of getting off track is incomplete goals almost. And then you also talked about this idea of the fringe hours being hijacked, right? And I think that is such an important insight, because any goal that you set yourself is going to be for the most part, like some element of yourself or your business improving, right? And that
Mm.
is what I like, those tasks and that kind of work is what I would put into the Eisenhower matrix of like tier two work, right? This is the important but not urgent work, right? Tier one is like the stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis, right? It's just the day-to-day things that are on our calendar that have deadlines that have to get done. And then tier two work is the important things that, hey, this will make a meaningful change. This is an important thing to do, but it's not urgent. There's no deadline, right? So we have to create our own artificial. There's a lot of strategies around accomplishing tier two work, but I think that tier two work, that important but not urgent, those tasks that are related to accomplishing our goal and moving us forward, improving, are those things that we have to make time for during those fringe hours. I would think it's just like that extra time. I mean, if I look at my own day to day, week to week, the fringe hours, I mean, you were pretty generous in saying that, hey, a lot of people might be using their fringe hours for like a side hustle. But in reality, like if I look at myself, I feel like a lot of my fringe hours are spent just like watching YouTube, just kind of sitting around, not doing anything. So how can we, is it just like an awareness thing? Like how can we take control of those fringe hours again and maybe put them to more productive? Maybe it's not doing work, but it can be creating that space for ourselves to just kind of reset and recover.
Yeah, great question. And I think it's highly dependent on environment and individual. So, there's a great quote actually from Matthew McConaughey.
Prepare to have freedom. What I mean by that? Freedom, calling audibles. Hey, I'll wing it. It's all a good notion. But we need preparation to have that freedom. Find out the structure of the situation. Know the rules of the game before you go play it. The more you prepare, the more when you are in the so-called game of life, you can call your own audible. You can improvise. You can riff. Because you know your plays. And they become instinct. You're not even to think about them at the time if you're prepared.
And you have to be structured. Like we need it as humans, right? We need to, okay, we're gonna do these tasks in the day. These are the important ones, these are urgent ones, just like you talked about. But what happens sometimes is we kind of erode into feeling like we need to do everything all the time, especially early entrepreneurs, right? Everything feels important. But if you create that structure, and I do this with my business by doing what's called context scheduling. And this is an idea that I picked up from a gentleman named Inketon Tank is his name. He's on X, he's on Medium, a great writer. But it was borrowed from him. And essentially what it is you block a certain amount of time in your calendar and be generous with that block in terms of how much time you block off. And then you plug in the tasks that you need to do in that time. But you don't do it in like half hour increments, 15-minute increments. It's like 3 hours or 2 hours. And so what ends up happening is then you're in less meetings because your calendar is blocked, but also you tend to complete those tasks earlier, especially if you're quite productive and efficient. And you can actually give yourself some creative space in that time to maybe explore something else with your business or explore this thing that maybe came across your desk the night before. You wanted to take some time and just investigate it. But what it does is it gives you that expanded window of time in the run of your day. The other thing that I do is that when I'm done, I'm done. And this is actually something I think I learned from Tony Robbins going to one of his events was, you do what's in your calendar and then you're done for the day. And I learned that lesson hard going through burnout in my life, but it's really, really critical to kind of evaluate, okay, have I done what I needed to do today? Even if it's just one thing, maybe it's 10 things, whatever the number is. And then, physically and psychologically changing your environment so that you can turn off and be present with those other things in your life. One other thing I'll add here too, and this is for folks that work in remote settings, is you want to have what's called a psychological cue. A psychological cue. And so whatever that thing is that allows you to turn off at the end of the day, you want to replicate that each and every day. So for me, in my home office here, I actually have a lamp on my desk. It's my psychological cue is at the end of the day, when I turn that lamp off, that's it. Like I'm done. And for others, it may be something else. It may be closing the laptop. It may be setting an alarm on your phone. Whatever it is, finding that important psychological cue, and then just putting it in your environment every single day will just allow you the space to not burn out and to kind of manage your energy, if that makes sense.
Totally. And the effectiveness of that little psychological cue kind of rhymes with an idea that hit me when you were talking about the most goals are only set with just the strategy, like one of the 3 S's that you feel are required to set a complete goal, where the psychological cue, the lamp, like kind of the indicator that, hey, the day is done. I can now transition into whatever it is that I have left for my day, that the other things that I care about outside of just work. As soon as you were talking about the idea of how most goals are only set with the strategic lens, and like that's the only clarification that's made, it kind of rhymes with this idea that's come up in a few conversations recently here on the podcast, where most of us really believe that we are just logical, rational beings, right? That if we just think things through, we have this logical game plan on how something's going to be accomplished, it's going to get done, right? And it's hit me again. I'm going back through and watching the Century of Self documentary series. Highly recommend. If anybody hasn't watched it, I'll link in the description of this episode. But it's really eye-opening to how irrational we can be as humans. And irrational not in like a bad sense, but there's just like a lot of subconscious things that are taking place that really govern our action that we don't really take into account. But I think most of us really assume that we're just completely logical, completely rational. If I just set this game plan, I'm going to be, and this is me included, if I just think things through, I'm going to follow through. But there's a lot more that goes into it for us as people, as us as humans, in order for us to kind of go and accomplish something.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I read this somewhere and I forget the author, so I apologize. But it's basically just like humans are not washing machines. Like we are emotional beings. We have feelings, right? And so we're going to have an off day. We're going to have a sick day. We're going to have a day where it's just hard, or life is hitting us hard, or something is changing kind of at the macro level that's really impacting our state, right? And so we have to just be aware of that productivity gets us so far, but we, just want to be as consistent as possible. And that consistent one day may feel a little bit different than the consistency you show up with the next day, but you show up. And this is one thing I was talking about a few years ago. Someone asked me, what advice you have for an early entrepreneur? And I was like, just do one thing a day. Like, just promise yourself, do one thing for your business every day. If you do that, that's 365 things you do for your business in a year. So it's the compound effect. And oftentimes we're doing way more than one thing a day, but it kind of gives us a little bit of perspective on kind of what's the baseline we should be thinking about, right? It could be just a quick email on this day, and then you're present with family and friends for the remainder of the day, right? But you did one thing. And so consistency, showing up, and not kind of getting overwhelmed with everything, I think is important too.
Yeah, absolutely. Start small, because you have to start. And if you try and pile way too much on in the beginning, you're just not going to be able to consistently follow through. And then as soon as you have like a few off days where you just did nothing, where you were just overwhelmed by doing too much, you just do nothing, then you kind of start that downward spiral of, again, that story that you tell yourself. If you keep it small but consistent over a long time period, you're going to start to build confidence, right? Because confidence, I think this was Ed Milet said, confidence comes from keeping the promises that you make with yourself. Right? If you just start small, stay committed, do that consistently over time, you're going to build up your confidence, and that story that you start telling yourself is going to change. Meanwhile, if you try and take on way too much early on, you can start to, at least in my experience, when I've done that, I can start to have like a downward spiral. But I'd love to double click into this idea of story, because this is something that's new to me this year. Again, just through conversations with people that I've had here on the podcast is what made me aware of this idea of the story you tell yourself and how important that is. Can you, maybe just to drive this home for listeners and for myself, like what is the story that you tell yourself, or like how does that story again play into the goals that you have yourself? So if we could see your example and what you say to yourself, we might be able to better understand and apply that to our own lives.
Yeah, great question. So, when I started out as an author, I started out to make an impact, to change one person's life. And, I feel like I've done that as an author. But I come back to that story a lot. It comes out a lot in my business when I'm consulting, doing one-on-one work and coaching work with clients. How can I be at my best so I can deliver some form of high value to my clients that they would never get without me. And so I think about that a lot. I think also for me, faith goes into that. So, I kind of have a higher purpose in my life. I'm now a dad. So I think about, what is my legacy that I'm leaving behind versus the resume that's in front of me. And so I kind of changed how I approach some of those decisions and conversations. And I'm always kind of thinking as part of my story now of, what is my daughter going to think about this when she grows up? What is she going to say about this? Is she going to be proud that her dad did these things, change these lives, help these individuals? Or is she going to say, he wasn't present, he wasn't around, I don't know him, that we know these stories exist. And so being mindful of that, I think, has definitely shifted my perspective on things. So I think a few things there. I think, I always come back to waking up every day, with the goal in mind of making an impact in someone's life. That looks different, whether it's a reader that reaches out, a client that reaches out. If I'm delivering a talk, someone coming up after saying, this was incredible, thank you for this one specific thing. Those things fill me. And those things really, I think, are important to me. But I think one of the biggest things that I've recognized coming out of the pandemic, and I live by this too, is the story of the home. So I work from home. I'm blessed to be able to do that. But wellness really starts in the home. And so how I show up in the home, how am I at my optimal self for my family, for my clients, for my work? How can I juggle all of that in this environment? How can I create an environment that just allows me the space to feel like that's peaceful, that's calm from the storms of life and the noise of the world? And I think we've done a really good job of that in our home. It's very, very hard to do. But I think about that a lot as part of my story. Are these actions adding peace and well-being to our home, or are these actions and decisions taking me out of the home, removing me? Maybe I'm on the road traveling, things like that. So it really forces me when to say yes, when to say no, and when to be mindful of what needs to be done when. Hopefully that makes some sense, but I do feel it is a little complex and it is a little unique to each and every one of us, but hopefully that helps someone out there to think a little bit more about the stories they may be telling of themselves and in their home as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that 100% makes sense. I think from what I took from that, the story might be the most enduring part of those three S's. The story is kind of this enduring, rarely changing filter that you can use to kind of run the strategy, the goals themselves that you set for yourself through. Like, does this fit with the story that I want to live? The story is the idea of the impact that you'll have on others, what others are going to say, about what you did, right? What is the story that other people will tell about how your work impacted them, whether that be your daughter through the lens of her as your father, or your clients through the lens of you as a provider of a service to them. But the story seems like the more enduring piece of those three S's, where you have this story that you almost want to play out and then live. And the tactical, kind of more strategic of how-tos and what's are going to be the parts that change, but the story seems like the more fundamental, enduring piece of who you are.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And our stories shift through our lives, right? It does endure, absolutely. Different stages of life, demand different things from us, but also give us the opportunity, right? I think John C. Maxwell's big on this. I like it, but I kind of take it a step further. He talks about like learn, earn, and return. And so we live our lives in those three phases. We spend the first third of our life learning. We spend the second phase of our life earning, and the third phase of our life returning, giving back. Now, I like to think about those constantly happening because I'm always learning, always thinking about ways of giving back. But I think that's where story fits in really nicely, right? Is what am I going to do to make the world a better place as I learn, as I earn, and what can I return? Yeah, it just came to mind as you were mentioning that, Ian.
I love it. Yeah, so story is so much more than just self-talk, right? It's a lot deeper than just self-talk, which is kind of what I had taken it as face value. So I'm glad we explored that idea a little bit deeper there. So let's pivot into something where if a listener, somebody's listening to this, again, including myself, this conversation, who, maybe does feel a little disconnected, a little bit off track from, these things that I say I care about, right? Like these goals, strategic goals that I have for myself and, I see for my future that I want to achieve, I feel disconnected, maybe a little bit off track. Where should somebody in that situation start, in your opinion? Like to kind of get back on track, regroup, and start moving in a more positive direction?
Yeah, so this is where we can get into values. So I kind of teased that earlier in the conversation. Values kind of guide everything. And this took me a long time to figure out. Research kind of shows that we need to really have 3 to 5 core values. Any more than 5, and it gets to be too much. And you could do less than 3, but most humans, once they start the process, it's hard to find less than 3 things you value. So 3 to 5 tend to be kind of the magic sauce there. So clearly identify what those are. And again, we're not taught that in school. So where does someone even start with that? Well, first, it's really about, okay, well, what do I enjoy? What fulfills me? What makes me happy? What do I like spending my time doing? When you start to think about those things, you'll start to see some common threads emerge, especially if you're using a journal. And from that, you can start to kind of pull out what those values are for you. And so, again, this took me a long time, especially in the business world. Okay, well, I feel like I should be doing this, but it's a little bit outside of what I'm passionate about, but I'll do it because the client's paying. Well, it doesn't really align with my core value. And so I'm getting better at saying no to those things because it doesn't really align with my core values. But for me, mine are what I call the 5 F's. And they're in no particular order, but it is family, food, fitness, finances, and free time. I love free time. And so when I start to think through those, and I have a whole workshop on this, so it's hard to really get into, but those are very clear for me. So what I do is when demands come in, when there's a new client, a new opportunity to speak, whatever that thing is, I look at those 5 F's and I think about, okay, how will that decision impact those values, or how does it align with those values in my life? Is it going to contribute to our financial well-being? Yes. Is it going to take me away into a remote community where I can't work out anywhere because I don't have the infrastructure and it's minus 50 because I live in Canada? Okay, well, that's something to consider because it's a value of mine. So once you start to really be clear with those, you can run decisions through that values filter, and it starts to weed out the things that maybe you can say no to, and that's okay. Again, this takes a lot of work, but I think if someone were to start, it would just be to write down those things again that kind of fulfill you, make you happy, bring joy in your life, and then start to kind of pull, oh, what are those breadcrumbs telling you? And that may be where you actually start kind of figuring out your values.
I love it. And then those become the practical day-to-day filter for what you do. So you have those values. How do they really truly become something? Because I've done similar exercises, not as intentional, as clear, and as thoughtful as what you had just laid out. But I've done those things where I've, written it down, kind of gotten this clarity, and then, they just kind of stay on the paper, right? They stay on the page. So like, how can we actually move them from the page into day-to-day behavior change and action? Is there anything that you can shed light on there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love this. This is where we get into intentional living. Before we get there, though, one of the great things about values, there's a really good book on this by Brad Stauberg, and I believe it's The Art of Groundedness or something about groundedness, but values really are grounding. So it's basically setting the foundation for you, setting the foundation for the decisions you make, the things that you do. And so that's why they're so important, because they do ground you. This is where we kind of get into intentional living. And so intentional living essentially is trying our best to live in alignment with the things that we value most. That's essentially what it is. What happens with many of us is we expect outcomes, but we don't work towards those outcomes. So for example, I value fitness. Well, if I don't do it, if I don't practice it, if I'm not intentional about it, it's just not going to happen. If I, value financial stability, but I don't create the mechanisms for that to be possible, I don't put the work in to make that possible, it's probably not going to happen. And so we have to be intentional about it. And I speak a lot in the wellness space too, and this goes back to those New Year's resolutions, right? We think that wellness can just happen. And we kind of live at a time where, we have all these devices that can track heart rate and calories and all that, which is fine, but you still have to put the work in. And there's no shortcuts to that. And so that's really what you want to be thinking about. Now, in our lives, I have a kind of a framework here, but it's like a lot of us live on this side where we somewhat live with intention. And then we're in the middle, oftentimes in life and work, where we oftentimes live with intention, but not fully. But where we really want to be is on the far side of that continuum, which is fully living with intention. And when we do that, basically, if you picture yourself a rowboat with a team, everybody's rowing in the same direction, right? It is very clear where you are going. Your energy is aligned, and you just feel it. And so, if there's one takeaway there, it would be to focus on living with intention. And sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it, right? My wife and I were just having a conversation about this the other day. She said, Ryan, I feel like I'm just being pulled in all these different directions right now, and life feels very heavy. And I came back to, okay, well, what are your main priorities right now? Like, give me your top 3 priorities right now. And so she told me those. And I said, put your energy into those 3 areas when you get up tomorrow morning. Be intentional about being perfectly present in those areas. Remove the distractions, remove the phone. And she had a much better day because of it. And so sometimes we need those guardrails, and sometimes we just lose sight of it, and it's important to come back to.
Yeah. And in that example that you gave, sometimes we just need another person, right, who's aware of the thing that we're trying to do and can kind of help us in the journey of doing it, right, which is the value of working with somebody like yourself. And this is a good opportunity to listeners know that if what you've heard so far is something that you're interested in exploring more and would want somebody to kind of guide you through this process, you can check out the links to all of Ryan's work in the description and all of the resources. I checked out your website. You have an incredible amount of resources available to people on that website. So definitely go check that out. We'll have the link in the description. But I love that. I think that is probably where I have struggled the most is, and I don't think I'm alone in this, especially in, the young male demographic of somebody who's trying to go out and, build a business, is trying to do it on my own, not really having anybody in my life to be a standard bearer, I guess, for myself, like kind of help me to kind of talk it through and kind of bring me back and almost slow me down in a way. Because I think, again, it's my tendency to, all right, I have these 5 values clarified. This is how I'm going to live my life. Every single decision, every action is going to kind of run through this filter. I'm not going to make any mistake. I just jump way too big into it, or that's in my brain. It's like, okay, I'm going to start immediately living this way right away. And the moment I don't, I just it all kind of crumbles and I forget about it and I just don't even think about it anymore. It's like all or nothing kind of mentality, right? So I guess maybe going back to the idea that we mentioned earlier is just trying to start small, give myself some grace and like patience with myself in the journey. Is that something that you should probably expect or kind of set as an expectation for yourself? Because it sounds like this is going to be a big transition.
Yeah, absolutely. You are spot on, Ian. Again, we are emotional, right? And life happens, right? Like there's days where, I don't get the workout in. There's days where I don't eat as great as I should be eating. There's days where I don't sleep as much as I should be sleeping according to the recommendations. There's days where, I chose or I felt like I needed to do this, and a sacrifice was quality family time. And so it's a constant kind of journey that we're on. And yes, you do absolutely need to give yourself grace. Because the other thing too that's interesting is, and we might get into this, is this idea of seasonality. So I talk about this too, because a lot of times the work that we do kind of ebbs and flows in different seasons, right? Like I started my career in the school space. So August and September, pretty much until November, were crazy with professional development, resource development, conferences, whatever. So I knew in July every year that this season coming up was going to be busy and require a lot of me. And it would be the same in the corridor between kind of February to May. But then I knew that kind of June and July again, and December and January were a bit lighter. So if you understand the seasonality in the work that you do, you can kind of look at those values and say, okay, there's going to be some friction here. There's going to be some friction coming up because I'm going to be on the road, or this task, like building my website or, scaling my business, is going to require, 60 hours from me for the next 3 weeks. And that's okay, right? As long as we're aware not to live in that season forever, then we can embrace it. And if we can communicate that to folks that are around us too, that are maybe worried about us or wondering how we're doing, they kind of know, okay, Ian's in it for the next 2 weeks or next 2 months. And so that's, again, taking me a long time to figure out, but I think seasonality is absolutely critical. And if you're in the space as an entrepreneur where you're doing creative work, you absolutely need to have low seasons where you can actually refuel your creative juices so that you can come back to the project, come back to the client, come back to, whatever it is that you're doing, and have even more creativity. But we will run out of that if we don't take the time on a low season to just be in that low season and rejuvenate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's not a formula that's going to have equal weights the entire time as you go through life. It's going to be an adjustment as you navigate the different seasons of life. Well said. I love it. So with our conversation here, I have one final question for you, Ryan. I really appreciate you taking the time here. We called this out a little bit earlier, but before I get to that final question, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, great question, Ian. I really love LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. Just search Ryan Fahey. Looks like Fahey, Fahey. Send me a DM on there. I also have a website, just foyconsulting.org. I'm sure you'll put it in the show notes so people can there's a little widget on there. You can contact me through there as well. And happy to have the conversation with folks on how I can support.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have the links to all of that in the description, the show notes of this episode, wherever you're listening to this podcast. Ryan, thank you again so much for the time. My final question for you is a recurring question that I ask every guest. But Ryan, if you had a giant billboard with one message to the world that everybody could see for 10 seconds, what would it say and why?
The goal is not more. The goal is more depth. And I think we need more depth. And so that would be what I would say on that billboard.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. That's very timely. Like, I think, again, in my own experience, in kind of operating in this ecosystem, not to blame it all on the ecosystem that are in the environment that I operate within, but it is very like, just, oh, I'm going to do this for 10 seconds. Oh, I'm going to do that for another 5 minutes. And then it's just like kind of jumping around to all these different things, like so many shiny objects, right? You talked about earlier when we were talking about the idea of fitness. There are so many, widgets and gadgets and things that you can kind of distract yourself with, or just, so many shiny objects to get caught up in that can prevent you from, one, getting started, and then two, just staying consistent and doing the boring stuff for a long time, right? Which is what creates that depth. Yeah. Well said.
Thank you.
Sweet. Ryan, thank you so much for the time.
Thanks for having me, Ian, and hope our paths cross again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening. The main thing I'm taking away from my conversation with Ryan is that results requires depth, right? And I have a tendency sometimes to get distracted by shiny objects and other opportunities and doing a different thing. But really, success or results, whatever you want to call it, requires doing something long enough to get good enough at it to be worthy of the result that you desire, if that makes sense, right? It's just depth over activity, right? Don't just do things to do things, or just don't do things to feel busy and then mistake that as doing stuff, right? You have to focus on a few things, prioritize, take that seriously, and then just kind of do the boring stuff of just continue to do the same thing over and over and just keep getting better at it. If you want to get connected with Ryan, you can find his website and LinkedIn in the description below. And if you're a coach, author, or course creator, and you want to make it easier for your clients to get results and engage with your ideas, download the free Program Execution System Toolkit in the description. It'll show you how to install what I call execution infrastructure, which essentially is just a library of AI tools that will help your clients do the work and kind of guide them through the process of engaging with and completing the work in your program. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all in the next one.